So I'm really curious how Stellar has apparently more capabilities than Ripple.
Today, we will talk about XLM and XRP and their involvement in the Wyoming stablecoins.
So I'm really curious how Stellar has apparently more capabilities than Ripple. And in what way in these two ecosystems for the purpose of launching a stablecoin? Ripple just launched one. It seems to satisfy all those requirements, but they were excluded. An $84 billion ecosystem that's been around even longer than Cardano, as was Cardano. Algorand was also excluded. Tezos was also excluded. Aptos was also excluded. Dozens and dozens and dozens of viable, interesting ecosystems were excluded. Not a chance to try to build a proof of concept to demonstrate that they were capable of that. The former Consensus employee executive director made that decision. So there you have it, XRP community.
And that right there is a key part of what I will talk about. The alleged drama in between the XRP and XLM quote unquote communities is ridiculously overplayed in my own humble opinion. And I believe that Charles Hoskinson is playing the role of the useful idiot here. And I do not mean that in a way that insults his own intelligence or his own experience. I just mean that I think that he is playing a key position of a public-facing pawn in the larger scheme of things. And to expand on that, Stellar has been chosen as a finalist among 5 L1s for the development of the Wyoming Stable Token. And it was chosen as a finalist, beating out Ripple and Cardano. As is called out here, if you search for Stellar, and it says that in fact at least one company says it has already created a Wyoming stable token for testing purposes on its Stellar testnet, which is shown on Stellar Expert here. And it's all just incredibly coincidental timing, primarily because of the launch of RLUSD in conjunction with the new and apparently crypto-friendly incoming Trump presidency. Here is some commentary from Anthony Scaramucci, who will pop up at a later point in this video as well.
And it's resonating. And so I think he's resonating. We participated in a few events with Danelle where Senator Schumer, who is the majority chairman of the Senate right now, has said to us, as close as we are here talking together, that he's going to pass cryptocurrency legislation, a stablecoin piece of legislation in the next congressional term. And so I believe we've moved the needle enough where this will be bipartisan over the next 24 months.
And why is it so important to get the U.S. involved in this?
Well, you know, we still have 25, 27% of the GDP, however you're accounting for the GDP. We still have the biggest liquid market, the deepest, widest liquid capital markets in the world. And this, if we get this going in the U.S., we have some things that we're not doing so well, but one thing we do really well is innovation in our country. I don't know if you guys saw over the weekend, Elon Musk is like rockets into like, you know, the Mozilla, whatever that thing was, it like rocket, okay? Something we do really well in the U.S. And so if we can clean out the regulatory speed bumps, I think this would be an amazing thing for the world. And again, it's not going to be U.S.-centric. I'm not saying that, but that's me specifically what I'm saying to U.S. elected officials about this topic. This should be a global thing.
And as I speak on often, a lot of this comes down to the involvement of the PayPal mafia, which involves not only XRP and XLM, but also Stronghold and Halo as well. And before I get into how Stellar is the chosen one here, I want to talk about the proposed drama on how Cardano and XRP were excluded here. And in my own humble opinion, I think it comes down to wherever there is a Ripple headline, Stellar is oftentimes in the background creating tangible infrastructure. The interesting piece here is how in 2020, Ripple actually filed an LLC in Wyoming, as can be reflected here in a 2021 article. And I found that interesting because it allows for a scenario that permits a swap of stock or other types of assets, which ties into a lot of speculation around the XRP escrow, as well as my own speculation on how Velo and the CP group could possibly position themselves to acquire Ripple via an IPO. Here is an article about the Charles Hoskinson drama, which I just find extremely interesting because it does have kind of an allusion to Lobster, which is not only a Stellar wallet, but is also one of its older node operators as well. And it just seems a little conspicuous because Charles Hoskinson has been extremely anti-XRP until about probably a couple of months ago now, at the very most, when he was beginning to get publicly involved with the incoming Trump administration. And especially because Wyoming has been testing on Stellar over a year now. And I do think that there's some kind of a electrical element here. And a lot of that ties into my speculation on how the PayPal mafia is extremely interconnected, especially with how Elon is involved in the next administration. And on top of that, Charles Hoskinson recently had a meeting with Jed Caleb of Stellar, who also replied his post on how Stellar is extremely different from Ripple at this point. And in a lot of ways, that's a lot more advanced. Part of that is because at this point in time, the XRPL is averaging about 20 TPS, has no native smart contracts, zero knowledge proof support, and is, in all honesty, extremely hard to show proof of world adoption compared against Stellar. To touch on how Anthony Scaramucci is important here, him and Benell have a history. And with Anthony's former involvement in the first Trump administration, I think it's important. He recently spoke at the 2024 Meridian Conference, and he is also personally involved in Wyoming, called out here, right alongside Benell and Stellar. He has also recently talked about the Wyoming Stable Coin on a podcast.
I wanted to talk to you a bit about the Wyoming Blockchain Symposium that Salt hosted last week. By the time we air this, it will be last week. How was it? What were the themes? Tell me, like, what was your biggest takeaway as someone like overseeing all these operations and conversations?
So it's interesting. So truth be told, I'm halfway through the Wyoming Blockchain Symposium and say, well, what do I mean by that? Well, what happens to me when I run a conference, I'm the bride at the wedding, but I'm also the cadaver at the funeral. Okay, so I'm running around like a crazy person, but I'm not seeing everything, right?
Yes, that's
and so
true.
now I've got links from my team. It ended on Friday. Today's Tuesday, so I've gone through half of the sessions, and of course, I participated in 2 of the 30 sessions. But here's what I would say. We were gratified by the turnout. We had very high level C-suite people. And I was gratified by the turnout. And if I had to say, based on my observation, what are the 3 things that I got out of it? Number 1, there will be bipartisan comprehensive legislation for this industry. The czarist authoritarian, the Donald Trump of the SEC, Gary Gensler, will be behind us. Even if he stays in that job, he won't have the power that he's been given because you're going to have very clear, crystal clear regulatory guidelines brought to you by the United States Congress. So I absolutely believe that. Number two, the industry is not only here to stay, but I think some of the promise that you'd like to see from the industry is going to start happening. And so I'm going to draw a comparison to Web 1. We had something in Web 1 in 1999 called Web Vans, and it was supposed to be a grocery system where someone ran around and delivered you the groceries. It didn't work. It went bankrupt, but we did pick up DoorDash.
Yeah.
We had another thing called pets.com. It flamed out, but now we have something called Chewy that's doing quite well. And so what ends up happening is, to your point earlier about being early on something, I was early on the ETF. The government wasn't ready for it. They rejected it. And now there are participants that have successful Bitcoin ETFs. We're going to see that payment rail system, that promise that Jack Mallers is talking about from the Lightning Network, or the tokenization that could take place in real world assets on a token chain like Solana is going to happen. So that's the second thing that finally is emanating. You're going to get the legislation. It's going to happen. And the third thing, which I think is I've gotten wrong. So let me just say how I got it wrong. If you had interviewed me in 2021 and you said, well, where are the institutions? Are they going to be entering the space? I would have said yes. If you said when, I would have said in the next 6 months.
A little bit.
And I got that.
Yeah.
And I got that wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I got that wrong because they were not here.
Yeah.
But
today.
they are on the doorstep now. And I'll give a couple of examples. You know, the state of Wyoming is involved heavily. The state of Wisconsin, $150 million in their pension fund allocated to Bitcoin now. Hedge fund managers, you can go to Bloomberg and look at the list of hedge fund managers that own the Bitcoin ETF. I could go on and on and on, but you know, there's lots of activity on the institutional side. There are sovereign wealth funds that are not going to tell you, they're not going to come on your podcast and say, hey, Jackie, we're buying Bitcoin right now. But there are sovereign wealth funds that are allocating to Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
So it is happening. Something that I would have said to you in 2021, hey, by the middle of 2022, you're going to have tons of institutional investors. Got it wrong. So it's taking longer. It's almost like building a house, Jackie, okay? The contractor comes in, he promises the delivery of the house on a certain date, and 2 years later you get the house. You know, I mean, it takes longer than we would like it to. But those are the three things I got out of the event. And I had the time and the opportunity to speak with Senator Scott, Tim Scott, and Cynthia Loomis, as well as the governor, Governor Gordon from Wyoming. And you have a group of public servants that are locked into making this happen for people. So I like those things.
I can personally attest to the contractor metaphor because I was held hostage under an act of God clause in a contract that was pretty obviously not an act of God. However, that is probably a different conversation for a different time. Here is the Wyoming Stable Tokens site, and on here it specifically calls out Stellar in a few specific ways. It is not the top scored option at this time. However, it appears as if the real world asset tokenization is weighing heavily in its favor. And on the topic of scoring, here is the spreadsheet on how Networks is actually ranked. And if you scroll to Stellar, it kind of appears as if it meets all of the requirements.